She had not seen her children and grandchildren for quite a while. Jobs had caused them to relocate and move off to another spot, and she was missing family and missing the grandkids. So her son sent her a plane ticket to fly and spend some time with the family that they were desperately wanting and missing. She had never flown before, but her friends told her, "You're going to enjoy flying because when you get 30,000 feet up in the air, the view is amazing. The clouds that you can see, the horizon, you'll see the waters. You look down on the land, it'll look like it's a piece of puzzle that was put together like that. The mountaintops, the waters, it's going to be amazing. You just sit back and enjoy the journey." So she gets on the plane, and she's walking down the aisle. She finds her seat, and the seat had not been cleaned very well from the previous flight. And she directed the stewardess's attention to that. She said, "The seat's kind of soiled. Can I sit somewhere else?" And they said, "Of course," and they moved her then. And the seat that they moved her then was next to a crying baby. So she got the stewardess's attention again, says, "I don't mean to complain, but is there another seat for me?" She said, "We'll seat you in another place." So they put her in another seat. And in that particular seat, you know the little air conditioning things they have above you? That wasn't working. So she called the stewardess and says, "The air's not working here. Can you put me in another seat, please?" She said, "Of course," when we moved her again. Then she got in that seat, and she was going to have some time to read her book on the flight, but the light above her wasn't working. So once again, she went to the stewardess and says, "I hate to complain, but can you put me in another seat?" And this goes on several more times until the pilot comes on the intercom and says, "Would you please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts? We are about to begin our final descent." She had missed the entire beauty of the journey because all of the inconveniences that were drawing her attention. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like the one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those who not having the law. To the weak I became weak. I have become all things to all men, so that possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." This is a general call to all Christians for all times, not just for Paul 2,000 years ago. And I need to clarify up front as we talk about becoming all things to all people, there are limits to this. We do not take drugs in order to be able to relate to people who are on drugs. I'm not going to start using profanity in order to connect with a segment of society that uses profanity. That's not the part of it. But 5 times he says in this, his aim is to win people. Verse 19, that I might win as many as possible. Verse 20, to win the Jews, to win those under the law. Verse 21, to win those not having the law. Verse 22, that I might win the weak. 5 times he says, my aim is to adapt to the way people live in order to win them. And then at the end of verse 22, he gives a summary statement. He says, I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now, did you notice the change in terms? 5 times he said to win them, and then he summarizes it by saying to save them. Save them from what? Most of us in this room, if we have a church background, we probably understand the word saved when it's used there. Saved from the present penalty of sin, saved from the future penalty of sin, saved from the wrath of God, saved from an eternity in hell if you do not accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And in Romans chapter 5, Paul, the same one who writes this, says, since we now have been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? I have become all things to all men, that by all means I might save some from the wrath of God, from the penalty of sin, from eternity in hell. Paul was saying that he was willing to deny himself and give up some of his rights in order to reach people with the gospel. In fact, if you read through that entire chapter, you will find that he denies himself rights, his own privileges, in order to reach the other people. Now, what has happened in churches in America is that we view the gospel in a little bit different way now. The good news is a means to deal with depression, and it is. The gospel is a good news and an aspect to deal with grief, and it is. It's a good way to help us deal with loneliness, and it is. It helps us deal with low self-esteem, and it does. It helps us with our fears, and it does. But that is not what makes it the gospel. If the gospel touched none of those social ills and emotional problems, it would still be good news because it saves us from an eternity in hell. And since we now, for the most part, view the gospel as a means to address social ills, we are no longer motivated to reach people to get them out of hell and into heaven. And Paul sets a biblical precedent that this is so important, I will adapt in certain areas in order to reach people with the gospel. Even to the extent that the partner, the young man who traveled with him, a young man by the name of Timothy, who was not a Jew, his father was a Greek. And if you are a Jew back then, early in life, you were circumcised. Since Timothy was not a Jew, he was not circumcised. But Paul said, Timothy, if you are going to reach the Jews, even as an adult male, you need to be circumcised. A small inconvenience. The single fastest growing religious group of our time are those who check the box on surveys now, none. Paul sets a biblical precedent that is so important. He says, because my convenience is secondary to the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom and making disciples of Jesus Christ, I will adapt. And we have a growing segment of our society, the fastest growing segment is on every survey, they will check the box, none. What is your religious preference? We have now moved from an Acts 2 missional context into an Acts 17 missional context. Allow me to explain. In Acts chapter 2, which a lot of theologians consider to be the birth of the church, when the church, as we know it, actually started in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, Peter preaches a sermon that day in which thousands come to the Lord and are baptized. In that sermon, he is able to draw upon their past and previous knowledge in order to preach that sermon. He talks about a God that they knew and cultures that they knew and concepts that they knew. He was able to do that in Acts chapter 2. When Paul gets to Acts chapter 17, he's in a place where there is an altar that says, to an unknown God. He cannot preach the same sermon that Peter preached in Acts chapter 2 because it is a different culture. He has to back up and explain things. He has to back up and adapt. He has to back up and change. And we are seeing that same cultural shift in America. The things that used to be normative us in a church are no longer normative in our society because a lot of people are checking the box, none. For example, when I read the passage in Romans chapter 5 just a minute or two ago, since we have now been justified by his blood, if I were preaching on that passage today, I would have to take a couple of minutes and explain the word justified, and I would have to explain the concept of justified by his blood, because we now live in a culture and a context where a lot of people who would show up on a Sunday morning have no clue what justification means. Come back another Sunday and I'll explain that to you. I must adapt the message. If I preach on Joseph in the Old Testament, I can't assume that everyone in the room will understand and know the history and the story of Joseph, be familiar with that narrative. So, what do we have so far? Paul has been teaching that we should adapt in order to help get people into heaven. Very plain, very simple. He is also telling us that what we preached 25 years ago will not work today because the missional context has changed. Now, what I just shared with you, let's put that on a back burner and let it simmer for a few minutes, and we'll come back and bring it back into this. I told you last week, if you gave me a couple of days, I'd come back and talk to you about something. It happened rather quickly, the changing of the stage. Wasn't what we planned. Going all the way back to January with the board, we presented pictures to the board. This is how we want to change. This is one of our goals for this year. This is what we want to do and change that. So it was planned all the way back to that point in time. And even when we got to that point in time, we got an Excel spreadsheet and began to work out how long it would take us 3 months, not just 3 months to build and change, but 3 months for me to sell the idea to you. Okay? And that's the reality of it. Now, before I say another word about this, before my passion for the church and the gospel may take over, and before my voice may crescendo and be motivated by zeal, let me say to everybody in the room, I understand. I get it. Jesus told us a parable about a good shepherd. He left the 99 to go take care of the one. And I have been told, it's been suggested to me, Rick, don't even bother with it. The number of people who are upset about the stage from one end to the other room of the room is a small, minuscule minority of the congregation. Don't even deal with it. But every person who calls this place home is important. And you are important to me, and you deserve to hear from me, and it may be that I get a little zealous. I understand. I hope you do too as well. Friday, July the 5th, I'm in my office. It is 11:09 in the morning. I wrote that time down in my journal. I actually shared this with you on a Sunday. I'll refer that to you and remember in just a second. I wrote it down because the Spirit spoke to me so strongly that I grabbed my journal, wrote down the day, wrote down the time, and wrote down what I heard the Spirit saying. Don't make people happy, make them disciples. Friday, July the 5th. Sunday, July the 7th, I put that in part of the message. It is not my calling as the pastor of this church to make anybody in this room happy. It is my calling to make you a disciple of Jesus Christ. 1 month later, I didn't plan it. I didn't set it up. If you look back on it, it was the Holy Spirit preparing me and you for this. And this is why I say this morning, I need you to listen. Not just with your ears, listen with your head, listen with your heart, and listen with your spirit. Because there's going to be several things I'm going to say this morning I've already said several months back. But I just don't think it's been realized and got in the heart and head and spirit yet. A month later, on August the 4th, I announced that the money had been donated to change the platform, to change the stage. At that point in time, we sat down on that Excel spreadsheet, that point in time, all the way till November. We were going to take that long to do it. After I make that announcement, that week, we get an offer of a work crew, painters, floating tapers, the carpenters. I can bring my work crew in next week, and we'll do all of that work for free. But after that week, they are booked for the rest of the year. Let me see. We're going to get a work crew free of charge for a week. Okay. So on August the 11th, Sunday the 11th, I announced that the work on the remodel of the stage would begin immediately. Do you know what also else began immediately? The rumor mill. No. All I had to say was change the stage, and I had already heard people saying, I'm leaving. Hadn't even seen the final product, didn't even know what was going to happen. By Tuesday, 1 or 2 phone calls, and everybody in Southeast Texas knew there was going to be a disco ball hanging from the top of the ceiling with lights spinning around. And they were going to cut a hole out of the stage. There was going to be a hydraulic lift that was going to lift me up when it was time to preach the sermon. There was going to be a DJ over here who did the thing with the records while we were going in worship. Rick, you're being facetious. I am not that far off. God gave each and every one of us a phenomenal imagination to use for His glory. Satan also knows how to take it. And when rather than going to the right person, Pastor Andy, sitting right here, and say, Pastor Andy, what's the stage going to look like? We asked everybody else in Jefferson County what it was going to look like. And we ought to know, as born-again believers who have walked with the Lord for years, what happens when that occurs. People have left churches, and not just gone to another church. People have left church, period, because of misinformation. And I'm giving you a heads up, this is a teachable moment right here. This is not the last change. I've told you about the coffee bar that's coming. No, 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 no. The percolators are going. It's going to be a nice little coffee bar with all the little things you can press in there and get all. Now, so listen. Leanne Norman is our connections pastor. She is also head of First Impressions. So anything that is the first impressions, ushers, greeters, parking lot, that's her. When you walk in the front door, that's her department. So if you're going to ask about a coffee bar and somebody tells you, you know what they're doing? They're going to have some little French guy with a beret back there, little mustache, pouring bitter coffee in a demi-tasse cup, whatever a demi-tasse cup is. Just stop and go talk to her. That's all you got to do. Can I just go off for a second here? Every Sunday, there will be about 400 to 600 views of our live stream service on Facebook. I bet this week there's 800. Because you know what's happening right now? Somebody is watching. They have picked up the phone and they have dialed their little circle of friends. Tune in to the live stream. Christian Fellowship has problems. Go watch what's going on. I'm going to give them time to dial in, type in their password. Race, give me a close-up. Not real close, but just zoom in a little bit. Some of y'all are thinking, you're getting a little bold and brash. I am. I will repent later. Don't. But if you're tuning in to hear about our problems, let me tell you about the problems at Christian Fellowship, 3950 Point Parkway. For the past 3 Sundays, we have run out of parking places, and people are having to park on the grass and down the street where the construction company has their spot. We got a problem because every red chair in this building we have now put in the sanctuary, and we now have the most chairs on the floor that we've ever had in this sanctuary, which brings up another problem because everybody says, why do you have red chairs and blue carpet? That's a whole nother sermon for another day. That's a throwback from Hurricane Rita. We got that problem. We're busting out of our nurseries. I went back to the nursery on a Wednesday night and couldn't open the door without stepping on somebody's babies for all the nurseries that are back there. We had to ask one of our adult school, the Bible classes, to close down because of the growth in the children's department. The children needed another room. That's the problems we're having here. I'm going to show you some stats about churches in just a second. Of the 300,000 plus churches in America across the board, do you know what the average baptism is? Generically, every denomination, every church, every size in America. 0.8 per year. We are not even baptizing 1 per church. If you go back and look at our health matrix over the past 5 or 6 years, you will discover that we are averaging 24 to 26 a year. We are baptizing basically somebody almost every other week. You can concentrate and look at the small inconveniences and miss the beauty of the journey that God has taken us on. Paul, thank you. This is a conglomerate of the Pew Research, Schaefer Institute, Lifeway Research. This is the statistics for the attendance in worship, not membership, but attendance in services in churches in America today. What they call the smaller standard church, 0 to 49, makes up 40% of the churches in America. That's the largest segment of churches. Now, that includes rural churches out in the country. Okay, that doesn't mean they're an unhealthy church. You can be a very healthy church with 40 people in it. These are just the numbers. Larger standard church, 50 to 124, 27% of the churches. Mid-range churches, 125 to 249, 18%. A large church, 250 to 499, that's 8% of the churches. Very large, 500 to 999, 4%. The mid-mega church, 1,000 to 1,999, 2%. And the mega church, 2,000 or more, make up less than 1/2 of 1% of the churches in America. As churches begin to decline, the decline accelerates. It's like you are skiing down a slope. The further you go, the faster you go. So if a church has 200 people and they decline to 100 in 3 years, They will decline from 100 to 75 in 2 years. They will decline from 75 to 50 in 1 year. They will decline from 50 to 25 in 6 months. And after 25, they will close in 3 months. The longer you dive, the faster it goes. So I'm going to give you some information that's over from a guy by the name of Tom Rainer. Tom Rainer used to be the head of Lifeway Research. He resigned from Lifeway Research because he saw all of this. He said the greatest need in America today is to train people on how to revitalize churches that have begun that downward spiral. Can you, and some of you know Lifeway, can you imagine leaving the CEO position at Lifeway, what his salary package must have been to start your own little company to train people on how to turn around churches that are falling? When he saw all this, that's what he did. In America, every year, and this is the most conservative number that I found, 6,000 churches close every year in America. That comes out to about 115 per week. This is not up in Seattle or San Francisco or Baltimore. It's Christian Fellowship. We are a non-denominational church. We're independent. We're not connected to anybody anywhere. We're an independent church. My background, my roots is with the Assemblies of God. So I'm only going to pick on the Assemblies of God this morning. A very healthy denomination, by the way. But here in our area, the Beaumont area, not too long ago, there were 6 Assembly of God churches in Beaumont. There are now 2. First Assembly in Port Neches, closed down. First Assembly in Groves, closed down. Faith Harbor in Port Acres, closed down. New Song in Groves, closed down. First Assembly in Groves, closed down. First Assembly in Port Arthur, closed down. Parkdale Assembly of God, a phenomenal location right across from Parkdale Mall, is now the Steak and Shake. And there's another church on the corner of Lucas and Delaware. I don't know what that church was. It's now an Islamic mosque. We love our Arab neighbors, but we lost a church. Why is this happening? Every one of you, every home, when you leave today, there's going to be this article that's going to be out on the tables. Every home pick up one. Tom Rainer, the guy I mentioned before, wrote this article, and it's entitled, 8 Signs Your Church May Be Closing Soon. And I want every home in this church to read this article. It's very brief. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it to you right now. The 8 things. There has been a numerical decline for 4 years or more. The church does not look like the community in which it is located. The congregation is mostly comprised of senior adults. It's just a few years of funerals away from having no one left in the church. The focus is on the past, not on the future. The members are intensely preference-driven. They are more concerned about their music style, their programs, their schedules, and their facilities than reaching people with the gospel. Their definition of discipleship is others taking care of my needs. The budget is severely inward-focused. 7, there are sacred cow facilities. It might be a parlor or a pulpit. It could be pews instead of chairs. It might be the entirety of the worship center or the sanctuary. Members insist on holding tightly to those things God wants us to hold loosely. And number 8, any type of change is met with fierce resistance. The members are confronted with the choice to change or die. And although few would articulate it, their choice by their actions or lack of actions is the choice to die. Why are the churches in Latin America exploding? And now the largest churches in the world are in Latin America. Why is it that missiologists tell us that at the current rate of conversion, Africa will be a Christian continent within the next 2 decades? Why is it that in China, 30,000 people a day are coming to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ? Why is it that there is revival in Iran, and the people who come to a saving knowledge of Jesus in Iran go to one of the missions that we support, Kote, in the Republic of Georgia, because there's the freedom there, and it's right next door to Iran. They will go over to the building that we helped build several years ago to get their training and go back to Iran and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why is all of that happening around the world, and that's happening in our neighborhood? One of the ways that a church does not become a part of those statistics is for that church to have a vision in which we will literally try to work to become all things to all people in order to save some. A church that does not intentionally take steps to reach, keep, and disciple the next generation will become a part of those statistics. A church not willing to do what Paul exemplifies, that being to give up some of your rights in order to reach people, that church will become a part of those statistics. When your personal preference is more important than reaching the unchurched, that church becomes a part of those statistics. May I speak frankly for 30 seconds? If you were upset about this change and you called people, you had ad hoc committee meetings, you wept tears, and you have never cried over lost family members who are going to hell. You have never gotten on the phone and called an unchurched person and invited them to church. Your priority's in the wrong place. This is a building that is designed to bring people to Christ. From the cross on the top of this building to the smallest toy in the nursery, this building is nothing more than a means to an end. The end is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and to help make people disciples. Anything other than that, it's not a sanctuary anymore. Billy Graham led hundreds of thousands in baseball stadiums and football stadiums. The fact that there was a scoreboard up there didn't make Just As I Am any less anointed. The most phenomenal worship experience I've ever been in was not a sanctuary. It was not a camp, summer camp that I went to. It wasn't a church prayer service. I was at a leper colony in India. When you put emphasis on the building over people, you're still living under the old covenant. God did a wonderful thing in the Old Testament. He put together a temple, and he gave specific instructions. And that temple and that tabernacle was amazing. And it gave us insights and typology of what Jesus would be and what the New Testament would be. And that was a wonderful component. That was a major part of their life. But that old covenant changed in the New Testament. We're under a new covenant. And the new covenant says, you are that temple. And wherever you go is a sanctuary. This afternoon, when you go to HEB, you walk in the door, HEB becomes a sanctuary. Tomorrow morning, when you go to ExxonMobil, the presence of the man of God and the woman of God at that plant turns that plant into a sanctuary. This building is nothing more than a means to an end, and if you make it anything more than that, your priorities are out of focus. The week of the remodel here at the church, I want to give you a little insight into what it's like to be the lead pastor of this church. While the crews are in here doing everything that the crews are doing, this is what I was functioning with, dealing with that week. Individual with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. Individual with a stage 2 breast cancer diagnosis that they had to cancel the lumpectomy because they found a heart abnormality and they had to handle that first. 3 single mothers who could not afford school supplies for their child. 2 divorces, one for infidelity, one ongoing because of verbal and physical abuse. 1 spouse with Alzheimer's, another spouse with a dementia diagnosis. And as a result of this trouble in that family, the family got broke apart trying to put that back together. Plus, a pastor, a local colleague pastor, calls me saying, I'm ready to quit and leave the ministry. So understand, as much as this shepherd will go for the one, leave the 99 and go to the one, when you come to me and tell me you're upset about painting pillars, it doesn't even make my top 10 list. What's it like to be the lead pastor of Christian Fellowship? I love this church. I have told you many times when I have left other pastor meetings, I have gone out to my car and just stopped for a second before I left, and I just thanked God for my church because I listened to the problems they were dealing with, and I realized the blessings that were here at this church, and I said, God, I thank you for where you have placed me, and I give you praise for the church that you have put us in. But sometimes pastoring this church is like conducting a symphony orchestra. You've got all these parts, all these players, and sometimes you've got to have the brass ease up a little bit. Sometimes you've got to pull the woodwinds and bring them up a little bit. Sometimes you've got to get everybody speeded up on a tempo. Sometimes you've got to slow one part down. Sometimes you hit a nice note and you just got to kind of hold it right there and you just have everybody hold on to it before you cut them off. Sometimes in music there's a repeat. There's a section that is repeated. And the first time it goes through, it's just piano and the tenors. But then you repeat it and you add the bass and drums and altos. You repeat it again, you add some more. So there's sometimes I got to repeat some things over and over again until I kind of get everybody in there and everybody on that right spot. So when you look at this orchestra, this congregation, I've got people over here, I've got people over here, and I've got to kind of conduct this to where we kind of get here, and then we can go on from there. This was in my driveway this week. This is the phone book. Not just for Beaumont, you need to get this, including Nome, Gilcrest, High Island, Anahuac, Crystal Beach, Hampshire, Port Bolivar, Sour Lake, Winnie, surrounding communities, and including Beaumont area listings. There are some people in this room who have never even seen a phone book before. If I were to talk about yellow pages, most of the people in this room, 40 and under, have never used yellow pages in their entire life. You take your phone, you go, hey Siri, give me the phone number to Floyd's restaurant. Boom, there it is. How many of you remember the evangelistic teams that were the strength power teams? They would come in and bend bars and lift weights, and they would tear phone books in half when the phone books were like that. On a good day, I can do this one. Things change, and you have to adapt. My last analogy, and I will leave you alone for the day. A lot of us in this room, we know what it's like to have a TV that the screen was this big, but the box that it was in was this big. And you went and turned it on, and it didn't come on. You had to wait for a few minutes, and you could go in the back, and you could see the tube starting to light up because it had to warm up. And then once it warmed up, you had to get up off the couch and manually change from channel 4 to channel 6 to channel 12. And if you had a good antenna on a good day, you could get channel 29 out of Lake Charles. None of you have that anymore in your home. And one of the reasons you don't have it is because your grandkids would say, I don't want to go to Granny and Pawpaw's. They only got 3 channels, and none of them are Disney. So in order to reach some people you loved and have them come into your house, you upgraded your technology. What you did several years ago in your living room is all we did on this platform 2 weeks ago. Don't make it any more than that. We started 16 years ago. You've heard the story if you've been here a while, 64 people sitting in lawn chairs. What are the appropriate responses to where we're at today? I'll talk about appropriate and inappropriate. Here's an inappropriate response. I am so glad you changed it. That was so 70 lookings up there, and what you ought to do is just tell them, suck it up, Buttercup, and go on. When I announced that we were going to change the stage, somebody told me, the person sitting next to them said out loud, thank God. The same number of people who don't like this didn't like the other one. They didn't leave. They didn't call for a board meeting. They didn't call for a vote. They didn't quit tithing. It's just furniture. Appropriate responses. Rick, I don't like it, but I love the church. I don't like it. I will probably get used to it over the next couple of weeks and months, but I trust you. I trust the staff. I trust the board. I don't like it, but I get what Paul is saying. And if I have to deal with this for a little bit, and let me interject and change the context for just a second. Those who don't like it, the next time your adult children come visit you, I bet you $50 they're going to go, hey, that's kind of nice. So can you deal with this in order for your kids and grandkids to have a draw to the house of God? If you have not walked your way back to the chapel on Wednesday nights to observe Lane and Jolie and the youth group, I am so excited. This next generation is going to take this church further than we ever could have. They are going to do amazing things for God. They're going to do some tremendous things, and we have to be the church that intentionally says we will look to the next generation to reach, keep, and disciple. Now, as I talked about the room, we're already in this process of looking at going back to 2 services. Trust me, everything's going to be okay. You're going to be all right. If you honestly feel like, Rick, I cannot come into this sanctuary anymore and worship because of the change that you made, I understand. And with all the love in my heart as a shepherd and as a pastor, I'm going to tell you something you've never heard me say before. There are wonderful churches all across Southeast Texas. We want you where God wants you. I'm being facetious. Some of you are ahead of me already. If it's here, we're going to rejoice. If it's elsewhere, we're going to rejoice. The last thing I want is for you to get up every Sunday morning from now till Jesus calls you home and be miserable about coming to church. Life's too short. You go with my heart, you go with a hug, and you go with no bridge burned behind you. If you walk around and say, you know what, I'd rather go back and deal with those big screens, the door is always welcome. But if you're going to be here, I plead with you, I ask you, don't be a problem. God is doing too much already for us to have any component of this that will grieve the Holy Spirit. I was mentioning to the board our last meeting this past week, we were talking about the 2 services. And I said, well, if you put a gun to my head right now, this is what I would do. And I know several of you would exactly like to do that right now. I get that. I understand that. But I mentioned this last Sunday, and I don't do this arrogantly, but after 16 years of what we have gone through, I think I deserve a couple of weeks or a month or 2 of trust and loyalty to see this through.